Hi, Matt. How you doing today? Oh, we don't have audio. Oh, you're muted.
Trying to get the chat window out of the way for Zoom here. Sorry. Let's do this again. There we go.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much.
Are we ready to go? Yeah.
Yes, we are. I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit
about yourself.
Go ahead. All yours.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is my absolute pleasure to be a part of this event for the second year. It was an absolute honor to be invited to speak to this group. And I wish I could be there with you in person. I had thought I might be, and then I thought I was going on vacation with my kids, but we got a puppy earlier than we thought. So I can't really go on international trips right now. But yeah, my name is Matt Stratton. I work here at Pulumi, and I'm not going to really talk a lot about Pulumi today, but I'm happy to talk to you about it some other time. And I've been kicking around this DevOps thing for quite some time, and I thought this morning we would set the stage a little bit by talking about where did we get started with DevOps, get a little bit of a background, and kind of think about how the journey has happened, and maybe thinking about these ideas that I like to think about in the idea of cloud engineering, and how I think that's kind of a progression that has happened since then. So I think I always like to start by looking back a little bit, right? We want to move forward. We want to innovate and recreate the future or create the future. But it's always helpful to understand how did we get where we are so that we can compare that journey to where we want to be. So if we think a little bit about the history of DevOps, so to speak, don't worry, this is not a whole long history lesson, but it helps understand the journey. In a lot of ways, 2009 was a really essential time for a lot of the ideas that we talk about as DevOps today and where they came from. One of those was Paul Hammond and John Allspaw gave a talk at the Velocity conference called 10 Deploys a Day, Dev and Ops Cooperation at Flickr. And it was while watching this talk that Andrew Schaefer, for as best we can tell, this is the first reported use of the term DevOps, was in this tweet on June 23rd, 2009. And you can see it didn't get a lot of traction on the internet with 8 retweets and maybe 12 likes, but this was when this happened. And at this Velocity conference, Andrew came up with this idea. He said, hey, does anybody want to do, they called them birds of a feather sessions, but they were like open spaces. Does anyone want to have a conversation about this? And they proposed it, and one person showed up for that open space, that birds of a feather session. And it wasn't even actually Andrew. He didn't show up for his own, but it was someone named Patrick Dubois, who I'm going to talk about in just a second. But a couple other things that happened shortly after this, the book Continuous Delivery was published by Dave Farley and Jez Humble, which espouses a lot of the things we think about in modern CI/CD. And also, this is one that not everybody knows about as much, but Gary Groover and Mike Young and Pat Fulgham published a book with an incredibly long title. But really, it's about talking, if you read this book, this is all DevOps. They just didn't call it that. And I will tell you personally, when I was first learning about continuous delivery, I was listening to a podcast that Jez Humble was the guest on, and he was talking about this idea of continuous delivery that we think about today. And I remember I was driving in my car and listening to Jez talking about continuous delivery. And at the time, I worked for an internet company. I worked for a company called apartments.com. So keep in mind, this was an internet company. And I was sitting there saying, that would never work where I work. We couldn't do it. We have all these constraints. And then Jez started talking about what Gary Groover did and how they applied these principles to hardware and firmware of printers. And I sat there in my car and I said, okay, I guess this might work. Well, as I said, at Velocity, based on John and Paul's talk, Andrew and Patrick Dubois got connected, and they started this little thing called DevOpsDays. And the very first DevOpsDays took place in Belgium in 2009. And if you're ever wondering why we say DevOps, it's because Agile System Operations was too long of a name for a conference, because that's what they had in mind. But instead, they called it DevOps Days. And I thought it was really interesting to look at. There were 6 talks at this DevOps Days. A couple of years ago in 2019, we had the 10th anniversary of the first DevOps Days, and we had a summit where organizers of DevOps Days from all over the world came together to talk about organizing DevOps Days. There were more DevOps Days organizers at that summit than attendees at the very first DevOps Days. So that's how things have changed. But when I look at the talks that were given at that DevOps Days over 10 years ago, there are all sorts of things that we're still talking about today, about user stories, building agile infrastructure. You saw Chris Reed had a talk about continuous integration, pipelines, and deployment. You still see these talks today, over 10 years later. And we've seen great growth over DevOps Days, and especially in places like this event as well. My graph is out of date. I haven't updated it since 2019, but you can really see the number of DevOps Days around the world. And why I think this matters is because the principles and spirit and ideas that are DevOps, that changed our industry, that changed the way that we build and deploy and manage software and services, they came from the community. They came from practitioners. And sometimes I think we might be losing that a little bit. And I'm going to talk about that for most of my talk. And but when we think about what DevOps is, I always want to remember that DevOps came from DevOps Days. It came from the community getting together. And I'll tell you something else. Andrew Schaefer, who was one of the people who started this, said if it was up to him, that first DevOps Days and DevOps Days in general wouldn't have any talks. It would all be open spaces, but he knew that nobody could ever talk their boss into letting them go to a conference if there weren't talks. So the point is, all of this communication and collaboration from people, from all of you with each other, is what defines and shapes what DevOps is, or at least that's what we're hoping for. Now, I don't like to, DevOps can mean different things to lots of different people. I just want to talk about a couple of definitions that I've seen that I really like. So Donovan Brown from Microsoft, he refers to DevOps as the union of people, process, and products to deliver value, right? And there's things about that. It's the union, it's all of those things, and it's about delivering value. And then Andrew, more recently, when I pressed him to give me a definition that he didn't want to do, he said it's about optimizing the human experience and the performance of our software with software and humans. And if you saw my talk here last year, I spoke a lot about the socio-technical systems that we build. And I'm not going to go into that as much today, but I want you to think about that our systems are made up of humans and they're made up of software. Also, a few years ago, I said, it's great to think about what DevOps is, but what is DevOps not? And I asked Twitter and a couple of my favorites, and I think they still stand up today, is that DevOps is not just about putting your developers on pager duty, right? It's not just about T-shirts and stickers. It can be a little bit about T-shirts and stickers. And it's not just copy pasting answers from Stack Overflow. I actually think that might really be what DevOps really is. Now, you may have seen before, and if you haven't, that's okay, this term of CALMS. And this was kind of created at the first DevOps Days in the United States in 2010 by John Willis and Damon Edwards. Came up with this, they called it CAMS. And later we added the L, and I'm going to tell you what they stand for. Now, the thing that matters is the order of these things in CALMS doesn't matter. Every one of these letters is just as important. So, and this gives us kind of a common way of reasoning about when we think about DevOps. I still think this stands up. This is now 11 years ago, we started using this idea. And I think it still speaks to the dream of DevOps. So we think about culture. Now, this is really sticky, and this sometimes gets people, sometimes people have, this is probably the one that people have the most trouble with as organizations. As I like to say, technology is easy. People are hard. people don't act like an interface, right? You can have an API and it will do what it says it will do and nothing else, and it will always live up to that. And I don't know about you, I have not found that to be true of humans, especially myself. So the people part is definitely hard, and the culture has to do with how we work together primarily. But it also resonates to what matters to our organization. What do we focus on? And a real key thing to think about here is, this is an old quote from Lloyd Taylor, who said, you can't directly change culture. So you can't sit down and say, we're going to have a project to change our culture, but we can influence how people behave. And all that culture is just a set of behaviors, the behaviors that are considered acceptable and rewarded within our organization. So when we think about that, remember, it's not a thing that we can just decide to change and suddenly say we're going to do it. It's about changing behaviors, and that has to do with incentives. The A, we talk about automation. This is the part of all of DevOps that I have the least need to tell anybody that it matters, because as I'll talk about in a minute, this is the part that everyone focuses on. But what does it really mean, right? And going back to that book on continuous delivery, again, I go back to these older resources, which is a little funny to me to say that that book was an older resource, but I guess it's 11 years old. Sorry, Jez and David, for calling you old. Even though we're the same age, I think. But this quote has always stood out to me, which says, when you ask experts to do boring and repetitive tasks, but are technically demanding, which if you're a operations engineer out there, this sounds a lot very familiar. This is the most certain way to ensure that a mistake, short of keeping people from sleeping or getting them drunk. And so much of what we have done in technology, especially in the older way of doing things like operations, when I think about it, I spent 20 years as a sysadmin, and boring and repetitive, but technically demanding is the best description of my work as a sysadmin for 20 years that I can ever think of. So what we're trying to do here is separate with automation. And I'm going to talk a lot more about why these things matter and how, more importantly, how to do them. And now lean is a little bit newer into the definition. And this is about the principles of lean manufacturing, really. What can we learn from that? And a lot of that has to do with, if you ever see people talk about value stream maps, and it's about looking for ways to reduce waste and focus on value. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to deliver value in our software because we have users, we have customers, we have constituents that obtain value from the thing that we give. And we want to be able to focus on that value, and anything that isn't providing value is a waste. It's a waste of money, maybe. I mean, I guess money matters, but to me, what I focus more on and what bothers me more about this is it's a waste of people's time, and time is the only thing you can't make more of. So this goes back into that empathy of all the people involved in our process. If we make things more effective and reduce waste so they can focus on things that make them valuable, they'll do better work, sure, but also I think we have a responsibility to our fellow human beings to understand that that matters. The M is about measurement. And when we talk about measurement, this can be things like monitoring and Nagios. And yes, we think about observability a little bit in this context, but it just means that we want to be looking at what we're doing so that we can see the gains that we're getting, right? You can't, sometimes people say you can't monitor what you can't measure, and some people don't like that phrase. I like to think about, you can't improve without measuring, right? You can't find the places to increase that. And if you're sitting to yourself thinking, Maddie, all of these things seem like they're pretty connected to one another, that's because they are, right? Like, you can't do lean. I can't go back and do a value stream map like this if I'm not measuring. Like, this is sitting here, for example, this is a value stream map about constructing a bicycle. Like, if I'm a bicycle manufacturer, and all the things I'm trying to do there is reduce time. Well, if I'm not measuring that time, how can I improve my effectiveness and my value? So we always want to think about how we're measuring things. And the S stands for sharing, which is so much connected to culture, but sharing can mean a lot of different things. It's sharing inside of your organization, but it's also sharing outside of the organization. And one of the examples of this that happened in the community that I thought was so powerful was a conference, which is now one of the largest DevOps conferences that we have in the world, but it's called DevOps Enterprise Summit. But years ago, we didn't have that. Before DevOps Enterprise Summit happened, if you went to a DevOps Days or you went to Velocity or you went to all these conferences, the only people you were hearing from that were doing this kind of work were startups or Silicon Valley companies. You were hearing from Netflix or Facebook or Microsoft, and those of us, I live in Chicago, and in my region of the United States, the Midwest, we are not hip and cool California startups. We have a lot of insurance companies and manufacturing and finance. And I remember, you're sitting there, and if you work for a bank or you work for an insurance company or some other enterprise, in the early days of DevOps, you were like, okay, but how does that work for me? Or if you worked in the government. And the thing was, in the DevOps community, we knew that behind that firewall, we knew people were doing this work. We knew what was happening at companies like JP Morgan Chase or at government agencies and all this, but no one was talking about it. And we had this event. This event happened in our community called DevOps Enterprise Summit, where enterprises came and shared what they were doing. And all of a sudden, everybody felt like they could do it. I like to talk about this term called the art of the possible. And to me, that means when you know something can be done, you're more likely to be able to do it. But if you have to be the first one, that can be really intimidating and that can be really scary. So having these examples, and that's not just about DOEs, about that conference happening, people had to do that. And I think it's remarkable how we have changed as an industry to be willing to share what we do, where people start to understand, yes, you still have things about how you do work in your company that you're not going to necessarily share because they're what provide your competitive advantage. Netflix is always the example I'd like to give. Netflix has always been very open about how they deploy software. Well, great, because what Netflix is not going to be open about is maybe their recommendation algorithm or how they encode video or something like that. The things that make them special. Just because I know how Netflix ships software doesn't mean that I can go and disrupt Netflix and put them out of business. So the more that we all can learn from each other, that's why we've seen the gains that we have in the last 10 years, because we're all helping make each other better. And this happens inside your organization as well. Now, I've just been talking about what the dream of DevOps is. We think back to those early days in Ghent in Belgium with the fewer than 100 people who didn't know they were creating a technology revolution. And we had all these dreams and thoughts, but what happened? Did we get there? I don't know. I kind of look around today and I'm like, I don't know that we're there. Something happened. And what happened? Is it all about automation? I feel like a lot of times this is the conversation that we have about DevOps. When people talk about doing DevOps, they're just talking about automating things. They're talking about configuration management software or talking about automating and scripting and orchestrating, but it's more than just the automation, right? I don't know, but that seems to be what we focus on and how we talk about. And I get it because it's fun, or is it just Kubernetes, right? Like Kubernetes is going to save us all. All we need to do is get some container orchestration using Kubernetes and it's fine. And every other single thing in the CNCF landscape that you need a new eyeglasses prescription to be able to read. We're talking so much about tools, right? Not about how we're doing things, but about the tool that we can install. This is a phrase that I haven't heard for a while, but people who wanted to do DevOps and enterprise, there's someone very famously, and I'm not going to call them out, said culture is for yogurt. And his opinion was all this culture stuff that we talk about in DevOps, that doesn't matter. It's about the automation and it's about the measurement. And I'm pretty sure he didn't think the sharing was good either. But we skip this and we say, it's not about culture, it's about this. And DevOps is being sold to you. People want to sell you DevOps. And here's the thing, you can't buy DevOps. I'm sorry to tell you. I can sell it to you, though. That's me who said that. But we're looking at it, this was a movement. This was a way of doing work. And now it's kind of like a product. But but it's not a product. It's a way that we work. That being said, I work for vendors in the DevOps space. I'm not saying you don't need to buy things to do DevOps, but you can't just buy things. So here's sort of the thing when I kind of think about this. We also run into this. So we had DevOps. Cool. That's a great term. But wait a minute. But then we're like, but there's other people involved. So clearly DevOps is bad because we need DevSecOps. Because what about security? And but now we're leaving out the business. So isn't it biz DevOps? Should we be saying? And what about serverless? Should we need serverless DevOps? And what about the DevSec DB Ops? You know, you got your DB ops and your regular ops, and you got to get security in there, and you can't have stuff without data. So maybe it should be called this, or is it DevOps? And here's sort of the thing that my first take on all of this is, it's just an unfortunate name. It was supposed to be this the whole time. We just called it DevOps, but it never was just about developers and operations. It's always been about security. It's always been about data. It's always been about the business. But words are hard, especially short words like DevOps. And this is tricky. We hear words the way that makes sense to us based upon our experience, our needs, our frames of reference. And the reason, before I kind of go into the next part, the reason I really want to get echo on this, and especially when we're talking about different languages, you know, there's nuance that maybe I understand in my language, but it doesn't come across in another language. So we try to make short words, but then we miss that nuance, or we try to come up again. Andrew just tweeted that 11 years ago. Andrew Schaefer did hashtag DevOps, and look at where we are now. And I'm not blaming Andrew unless he wants me to, but we have to understand there's more to it than that, right? But don't worry, I have more words for you. So we're going to make this even more complicated and think about maybe some more modern ways to think. And to misabuse maybe a famous quote, I come not to bury DevOps, but to praise it. So as much as I'm saying we've had problems with what DevOps has become, I still firmly believe in DevOps. I have seen the value that it gives. I have seen people have their lives improve because of the kind of work that we do with this. So I'm not saying stop saying DevOps, but maybe I'm saying let's take it back a little bit. Let's own it for what it is. And apparently the way I'm going to do that is by using another term. I like to think about this idea of cloud engineering, and this is a term that's been coming around a lot lately. And when people talk about cloud engineering, we say it's about employing standard software practices across infrastructure, across app dev, across compliance. Isn't this DevOps? Isn't this what we've been saying all along? But no one was listening because they wanted to get better bash scripting or something. They wanted to buy an automation platform. But this is DevOps, right? But cloud engineering maybe is a little bit easier to reason about. And it gets into kind of a different way. And I do think the two things are connected. So when we think about cloud engineering, it's really about the life cycle of things that we do. And I think about that in this idea of it's about building, it's about deploying, and it's about managing. All of the value, all of the services and systems and resources and things that we do to provide value to our users, at some point we have to do all of these things. We have to build them, right? And build can mean a lot of different things. It can mean writing your own code. It can mean piecing together components or frameworks. It can mean just provisioning resources. But build does not mean code. It does not mean write the application, but it's create, right? Well, then we have to deploy. That's the next part, because that's great. I can build a lot of stuff. Trust me, I got a lot of projects I built that no one's ever seen. They don't provide a lot of value. So it doesn't count until it's in prod. So we have to get that. But deploy is not just about shipping. It's not just about your pipelines. It's about how do you take this thing you've built and make it available to the people that will get value from it, right? Whether they're internal or external customers, whether they're your constituents, if you're a government agency, or they're your users in an open community. Deploying is taking this thing that I built and sharing it and getting it to someone who can get value. Well, manage, right? And this is, if we go back to the old way of thinking about DevOps, when we used to talk about the wall of confusion, which was the devs threw things over the wall. We had this mystical wall, and the ops had to run it and everything. A lot of the things when we talk about manage are what we normally would have thought about as being an operational thing. But it's not just about your web ops team or your infra ops team. It's about now we've taken this thing. Like, I made a beautiful thing, or maybe a little bit of a beautiful thing if you've seen how I code, but a thing. And I've shared this thing, but I don't want to, I can't go to my users and say, good luck, have fun with my thing. We have to keep it running, and we have to keep our overall socio-technical system running. And think about this. This all sounds like technology, right? We have to build, we have to deploy, we have to manage. This is going to sound like writing code and putting it in Get and shipping with a GitHub action and running, Sneak or something for security. Well, that's the technology that we have to build, deploy, and manage. But what about the people part of this? Our culture, our way that we work. We're also always creating and iterating on that. We're sharing it, deploying it, if you will. And we have to continue to iterate on it, which is also our part of our manage. So these all come together. It's not just about cloud resources and infra platforms and applications. It's all the messy parts that make up the socio-technical system that provides value to our users and lets us continue to be employed. So when we think about the build part, like I said, it sounds like it's just about writing code, but it's about creating the services and infrastructure that provide what our customers need, right? And again, if we're thinking again from the technical part, these generally tend to be cloud resources today. That doesn't mean you can't be a cloud engineer if you don't use the public cloud. It's just really kind of modern infrastructure. And we're building applications, we're building services, we're building infrastructure. And there's a lot of places where this comes in. And when we kind of think about that, we're going to sit there and we're going to maybe think about a shared services platforms. A lot of people like this idea. I am not here to offer guidance one way or the other about a developer portal or using Spotify Backstage or whatever the new hotness is. But I really do like shared services platforms because, again, we want to focus on our value. So maybe one of the things that's being built is this ecosystem upon which you can provide the value. Thinking about reusable infrastructure components. It's very fun to always create something new, but it doesn't always make sense. And in code, like in application development, we do things like libraries and packages and stuff. We don't go and write a sort algorithm every time we have to sort something, unless you're interviewing at Google or pretty much any other tech company, apparently. But we want to think about how can we build reusable infrastructure components so that they are pieces in the thing that we're creating. And how can we apply existing frameworks and tools? Again, we live in a very rich ecosystem. And there's things, if what we're building with our infrastructure is using something like TypeScript, or if it's using Go, we can take the frameworks and IDEs and testing and all the things that have to do with that, rather than writing our own stuff in our own framework that we create, whether it's for our infrastructure or it's for our applications. And again, when we're building the socio-technical parts, how can we apply existing frameworks like incident response and blameless postmortems and pieces to that? So how does this connect to comms, right? So these things are going to connect, right? I'm like, okay, build is a thing. So from culture, I guess you build culture. I realized when I did these slides that they could be read in a couple different ways, but the culture part of build is around focusing on differentiators. And here's what I mean. You should be spending time on the thing that makes your organization great and makes you different. And when I spoke to you last year, when I was here, I was working at Red Hat, and I was primarily working with the state and local governments in the United States. So I worked with a lot of public sector, a lot of government agencies. And I used to say, I said, are you the U.S. Department of Continuous Delivery? No, you are your health and welfare office. So why are you building your own continuous delivery platform? Charity majors to say that the best tool is a tool you don't need. The second best tool is a SaaS, right? Focus on the differentiator. Build the things that make your company special. And then also the culture is around having a common development experience across your infrastructure, across your application development. It doesn't mean everybody has to use the same programming language, but how can you make it? Because that lets you be able to learn from each other and everyone isn't living in their own little bubble, right? And this is what helps drive that empathy that we love to talk about in DevOps when we are building things in a similar way. The automation pieces that are connected to build, I talked about the reusable components, right? And leveraging the ecosystem so we can automate when we're doing these things. And again, avoiding the bespoke implementation. You don't have to make your own special implementation because I have news for you. You're not that special. Every snowflake has 6 sides. You may think you do things differently than anyone else, and I guarantee there are many organizations that have all the exact same constraints and problems that you do, and you can learn from them, and you don't have to write your own continuous delivery platform. How does lean connect into build? It's about that focus on value. So you're going to see there's a common theme, but they all interconnect. When we're building towards value, that's helping us drive efficiency and effectiveness. And the lean piece of build is helping us continue to improve the things that we are building and creating. And consistency breeds visibility. So if we are consistent in how we construct things, we can measure them much better than if we have a different way of measuring every single thing that we do. And then sharing is about reusable components and using an ecosystem that already exists that isn't your own special implementation means you can learn and share with people outside of your organization and learn, we can learn from existing practices. When we're building infrastructure, we can learn from building software practices as we've been talking about for a long time. But then we got hung up on automation. So in deploy, it doesn't count until it's in prod. And code and infrastructure don't provide any value until they're in front of our customers and our users. But we need to do that in a very efficient and quality consistent way. And if we have deployment processes that take too long or require too many manual steps, they block us from being able to get our features out or resolving issues. If you're built and deploy, if it takes you more than 15 minutes to get code out in prod, that's probably too long. I'm sure you have reasons, but I said what I said. When we apply these software engineering practices to our deployment processes, right, then we ship the same way every time. And it's become, one might say it's common practice to apply continuous integration, continuous delivery to our application software. But remember, in cloud engineering, we're talking about all of it. It's not just the application software. It's how do we apply these principles of deployment to our infrastructure, to our compliance, to our policy. And it's not just about providing tests. It ensures that all the steps are done in the same way too. Every human is capable of missing a step, even if you have a checklist. People love checklists. I love checklists, but they're even better when they're defined by a human and run by software, right? Because then for sure they got done. And automation, basically, at the end of the day, automation is a way of expressing our checklists in code that can be tested, reviewed, and managed. So the other thing is when we think about deployment, though, when we have a unified approach, it means we're thinking about our infrastructure and our code as being intrinsically connected, right? Infrastructure and the automation is all part of the application. It's not just something that's done on the side. And that allows us to have those better connections, right? So when we think about deploying, it's the same way every time. I mean, every time, not just when you want to, like you're always the same way. We have quality and security checks. My friend Julian Dunn has always said, security is just another aspect of quality. So when we think about our security checks, we think about them the same way we do our quality tests. And I talked about automating the checklists. Infrastructure is part of the application. This is deploy. How does this connect into cows? Okay, cool, right? So we have to deploy. I really didn't think about how these read. Deploy the culture. You should deploy the culture. Remember, The culture part is it doesn't count until it's in prod. So getting things to production in a safe way, in a predictable way, is a key concept of our culture. When we think about the culture of DevOps around iterative development, when we've got good deployment practices, we can do that. And this is also what's enabling our continuous improvement. Deploy automation is going to sound pretty basic. It's CI/CD pipelines, which to some people, that's DevOps. Just throw some CI/CD at it and you're done. It's not, but at least most people are vaguely aware of CI/CD now. But this is just part of deploy. Thinking about the automated checks. And again, checklists are great. Let's automate them, right? Cool. When we think about the lean practices, lean benefits from this fast feedback and having, like I went back and I said, hey, if it takes a day and a half to ship, how are you getting fast feedback? Now, understand, when I talk about wanting fast feedback, I'm not saying move fast and break things. I'm saying move fast and don't break things. We want to be able to get that, and we can only do that with good deployment practices. And again, it gives us visibility into the thing I talked about last year, that software supply chain, right? When we have this deployment pipeline that's consistent, we can see where those bottlenecks are and where those areas are for improvement in our delivery if we want to apply value stream. And the measuring, again, it's about visibility. Deploy gives us that great visibility. It lets us measure what we might call cycle time, or whatever metric is important for how your org works. You know, if you want to achieve my thing of saying, don't take more than 15 minutes to get your code shipped, well, you know, now you can measure it at least. But it's not just about speed, right? That time is what I think might be right. But there's other things you're measuring. You're measuring how many times does something have to go back? Like, where are you finding stumbling blocks? So that not that you can get people and tell them they're doing a bad job in their code, but to figure out how to move to the left so that we can catch things earlier and be able to have better effectiveness. And then, again, visibility, right? We just see more things. Great deployment practices let everybody understand what's going on. When we're using a common pipeline, it means less duplicate work. It means that we don't have to create a new way of shipping for every project and every discipline. We don't have, infra doesn't, even application software doesn't ship differently than security, et cetera. And then also it gives that we're sharing what changed. Because, I mean, let's be honest, most of the time when something goes wrong, is something changed. Maybe it's not your code, maybe your users changed and how they behave, et cetera. But it does let us know when we're trying to figure out what's going on. We have that visibility. And then I talked about manage. And manage is the one where I feel like I sit a lot because I come from that ops background. And I think a lot about, I've spent years thinking about resilience engineering and incident response and blameless postmortems. A lot of it has to do with when the stuff is running, right? So our customers are constantly using our services and applications. And we need to manage all of the resources and things that are part of that, including them, right? And this visibility allows everyone on our team, regardless of their role, to have a common understanding of what's going on. So you may have heard, security is everyone's job. And what that means in the world of cloud engineering is that we consider security and compliance, whether it's regulatory compliance or just your own policies, to be closely integrated into our work. And if we treat our policy as code, just like we treat our infrastructure as code, this is a really powerful idea. To think about these things that are happening, all the things to manage our systems when they're codified and treated like code. That doesn't mean just writing them in code. It means treating them like code. It means you're testing them. It means that you're version controlling them. It means you're deploying them. You're following build and deploy in order to do manage, right? And this means that we can apply these policy checks when we're expressing these policies as code rather than as prose in a document, in a PDF or a Word document or something. Then we can apply them both before and after we deploy our services and infrastructure, right? And this extends to a common vocabulary across everyone. There's a lot of stuff in terms of compliance where it'll get, again, like I said, it'll get written up in some PDF, right? Well, if the person who's writing that policy can express it in a code way, then there's no translation that has to happen between that PDF and into some kind of a check. So The other piece, so when you think about manage and how this comes again, I talked about it's about the visibility, right? Understanding everything that's going on. So when we think about ideas around observability, they really fall into here. Said, security is everyone's job. Everything is everyone's job, let's be honest, but still. It gives that common vocabulary. But also, these controls, they enable and enhance the work that we can do. Guardrails don't exist to keep you from doing something you want to do most of the time. They do it so that you can do the things you need to do without accidentally hurting yourself. And that's the way that I think about these controls. They're not there to get in your way. They're there to help you still be able to do what you need to do, but not accidentally, step in front of a semi-truck or something. So how does this connect to comms, like everything else we've been talking about? So in manage, that collaboration is really enabled through common code. So collaborative culture derives from common experience. And when we're all speaking a similar language, so to speak, it helps the collaboration. And again, guardrails can enable confidence. If I feel like I am safe and I'm not going to accidentally take down production because there's guardrails in place, then I can focus on the thing I need to do and not watching out to make sure I'm not doing something quote unquote wrong or dangerous, I should say. So I'm kind of saying flip how you think about it. A lot of times we see like compliance policies and all this, and we're just like, oh, how am I even supposed to do my job now? And if approached properly, they help you do your job even better, because our human brain can only focus on so many things at a time. And if my main energy is focused on, oh my God, I hope I don't accidentally drop the main prod table, I'm not focusing on the creativity that I need to do. So if I know that I'm in a safe place, that's unlikely to cause catastrophic failure, then I can relax a little bit and I can focus on providing value. And this also helps increase a common understanding across disciplines, right? The more that we're collaborating, again, it's just about that collaboration. The automation, I always like to say this, the computers can't lie, right? I have been through so many audits in my life that were such theater, because the audit consisted of someone coming to me and saying, Maddie, did you do this thing or did you not do this thing? And I'm not saying that I lied, but I could have. And how did trusting what a human says, or even worse, what a human remembers, show actual compliance? So our audits, when they're automated, we can trust them. And then again, we can focus on that. And this also, when we know we have these checks in place around that, again, it's giving me that trust so I can feel safer and I can feel more enabled and empowered to actually do the work that I need to do, because I'm not first focusing on protection. And our policy goes from being vague to being understandable. It's not just a bunch of words on a PDF now. Now it's something we can easily reason about. And if we think all the way back to when I said words are hard, imagine how hard words are that are written as a policy document that maybe makes sense to one person and not another. Code can only mean one thing. It just runs. It does what it does. This helps us when we think about lean to determine the improvements we might need to make for that safety and for that trust. And we can express these changes to our value stream through code. As we see where these improvements can happen, we're directly connecting them to something we're changing. We're not changing it by putting in a Jira ticket to get someone to go click on a bunch of buttons. And from the measurement perspective, this gives us great visibility into what is the current policy. Because think about this too, there's lots of policies that are written and maybe they're followed, maybe they're not. And if I'm new, I don't necessarily know what they are. I don't know what's been applied, but if it's codified, I can look at it. So like your code is a little bit like documentation maybe, right? And again, it lets us have a view of our current state of compliance. So we know where we're at. So if we are non-compliant, we're doing it with intentionality. We understand why, and we can make a decision. And this also lets us identify where policy and value collide, because sometimes that can happen, right? We can have a policy in place because it seems to make a lot of sense and it's causing us to lose value, to not be able to deliver value. And we can see that, and then we can make an informed decision about what to do rather than just our suspicion. And talked about the importance of a shared vocabulary. So when we're using the same approaches and principles and concepts and maybe even languages across all of the things we have to manage across our infrastructure and our applications and our compliance and our security, we have a shared vocabulary. And it lets us, we can utilize success patterns, because when things are codified, they're much easier to be shared and reused. And we can take great patterns, whether from the community or other parts of our organization. And then we can also share our learning that comes from this, whether it comes, and this is when it gets into more of, to me, a lot of the socio part of the socio-technical of the manage piece, which is about our retrospectives, you know, our post-incident reviews, the things that we've learned and how we can to keep these systems going, whether they're the people and socio and process part of the system or the technology part of the system. So this is what I am looking for the challenge I'm giving to all of us here in the industry is let's take the word DevOps back. Okay? DevOps was supposed to mean something, and it has started to mean something different. And I fully admit that I have worked for vendors that maybe are part of the problem. And so I'm here to say, we know what DevOps was supposed to be. We know what we want it to be in our hearts. And so let's work forward. Let's move forward. Let's build great things together. Let's get them out to our users and our community. Let's keep them running and keep learning from each other. I hope throughout the rest of these 2 days, you've got an amazing set of speakers and collaborative opportunities where you can learn from folks who decided to get up on the stage and talk to you, but you can also learn from each other. And we can continue to learn because we're a community, and this community isn't just taking place over these 2 days. So I thank you for giving me this morning to speak to you. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Stratton. All of my slides are up at this link at speaking.mattstratton.com. If you enjoy silly game shows on the internet, I have 2 of them now. I run one called DevOps Party Games, and I'm doing something for the CNCF. We can always talk about this stuff on the side and afterwards, but I very much appreciate your time this morning and very much appreciate everyone who has worked so hard to bring this event to you. You have I would just like to give my appreciation to the organizers of this event and to DevOps Days Worldwide and to all these great sponsors. And most importantly, thank you to you, because this event is made up of the participants in the event. Thank you.
El aplauso. Esos aplausos que por aquí hablando sola. Esos aplausos que tanto motivan y tanto necesitan nuestros ponentes el día de hoy y siempre. Por esos aplausos es que ellos vienen con tanta pasión. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, she said it. All we
Thank
have an
you.
audience. They clap you. Thank you so much for sharing knowledge and those welcome words. We have more of Matt Stratton. We're gonna take a short break right now, 10 minutes, and then he's gonna be joining meet the speaker by Sala Rio Negro. So we'll get it sorted out. He'll be hopping. You can chat to him, and we'll
figure it out. It's tech.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break. We'll set up the next speaker, which is Gabriel Alzate. Bueno, y vamos a tomar unos 10 minutos para el siguiente. Los que quieran conocer a Matt, él va a estar en la sala Meet the Speaker, el Salón Río Negro. También vamos a tener ahí traducción simultánea. Recuerden que está en la sala de Río Negro, donde va a ir. Listo. Para las personas que estaban viendo la charla acá, recuerden que tienen una sala habilitada en Hopin, la sala 2, traducción simultánea, si la buscan allí. Para las personas que no trajeron laptop o un dispositivo móvil, también tenemos unas salitas por allá afuera donde pueden agarrar las charlas que van a ser en inglés, aquí en español también.